2020 will be a turbulent year, although not as apocalyptic as some media try to portray it. The World War III will not start this year, and aliens will not invade the Earth. Major world powers will keep fighting proxy wars, but at the same time, behind the scene, they will negotiate the redistribution of the world's natural resources. I'm your host Kasim, and thanks for joining me for another KJ vid. In this video we will discuss 5 geopolitical predictions for 2020. I'd also like to take this opportunity to encourage you to visit our website kjvids.co.uk and sign up to our subscription plan, which will give you unlimited access to our content and the full transcripts of all of our video reports and a lot more analysis. The Middle East and North Africa will see continued, if not escalating, instability. The United States will keep pressurizing energy-rich Gulf states to increase production of oil and natural gas. Since Washington is very interested in energy, at this point a major war in the Middle East seems unlikely, as that would heavily affect oil and gas exploitation in the region. That, however, does not mean that this part of the world will be calm. Proxy wars in Yemen and Syria will go on, although the Syrian Arab army might capture the last piece of land that is held by Turkish-backed forces. If President Bashar al-Assad manages to reinstate full control over the Idlib province, the war in Syria might enter its last phase, where major powers such as the United States, Russia and Turkey will negotiate the future status of this war-torn and devastated country. The civil war in Libya will go on, and after Turkey's involvement, the conflict will escalate. In spite of that, fights will unlikely affect Libya's oil and gas production, as all the foreign powers involved in this proxy war are interested in stable energy supplies from this country. Presently, General Khalifa Haftar and his Libyan National Army control most of Libya and have pretty good chances to capture the capital city. However, since Turkey is expected to strongly back the UN-recognized government in Tripoli, the situation on the ground can radically change. Algeria and Lebanon are among the countries that can easily face destabilization in 2020, and Iraq will likely become a battlefield for a proxy war between the United States and Iran. For other Middle Eastern nations, this year might be relatively calm, but at the same time full of uncertainty and challenges. The standoff between Russia and the West will continue throughout 2020. Russia will strongly push to complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but since the United States imposed sanctions on companies that are involved in this project, which resulted in the suspension of the pipeline work, the Kremlin will have to make significant concessions to Washington in order to get the project completed. In an attempt to sabotage the Turk Stream pipeline, which is another Russian project that aims to bypass Ukraine, the US is expected to pressure countries like Bulgaria and North Macedonia. Moscow already spent at least $14 billion on the Turk Stream pipeline. That project is far from finished, as it currently connects Russia and Turkey, but not the rest of Europe. It is unclear when and if at all planned follow-on projects to bring Russian gas from Turk Stream into Europe will be implemented. Apart from that, Russia will have to find a gas and oil compromise with Belarus, which is Moscow's only ally in Europe. Minsk will likely keep distancing itself from the Kremlin, since Russia refuses to provide cheap energy to Belarus. At the same time, Moscow signed a transit gas deal with Ukraine, which is de facto at war with Russia. It is expected that Moscow and Kyiv will renew direct gas supplies of Russian natural gas, and Ukraine will likely get a significant discount. On the other hand, the positional war in the Donbass will continue in 2020, and many thousands of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic residents will keep getting Russian citizenship, and those entities will continue their de facto integration with the Russian Federation. Unlike the Donbass self-proclaimed republics who are tied to Moscow, Belarus will seek to improve its relations with Washington, but that does not mean that the former Soviet country will completely abandon Russia. President Alexander Lukashenko will be re-elected this year and will likely keep balancing between Russia and the West. The European Union will not collapse in 2020. 4 years after the referendum, the United Kingdom might finally leave the EU, but that does not mean that the other countries will follow the British path. The EU leaders will likely try to find a way to reform this entity, and also to oppose the expected US economic pressure. Washington might impose tariffs on certain EU goods this year, and the White House will likely continue to request from the European NATO members to increase their military spending. In other words, Washington will demand from its satellites to buy the US-made weapons. America will also sign gas contracts with several countries, and in the foreseeable future, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine and the Baltic states will start buying the expensive liquefied natural gas from the United States. It remains to be seen if Germany will be allowed to keep importing relatively cheap Russian gas, or if it will have to purchase certain amounts of the American gas. Germany's policymakers will also have to deal with domestic issues. Angela Merkel's Grand Coalition will likely collapse this year, but all major parties will seek to avoid snap elections. They will rather wait until 2021 when Merkel retires. In 2020, Germany will keep pressurizing the so-called Western Balkan countries to follow something that the Brussels bureaucrats call the EU path, which is an Orwellian term for colonial status of this part of Europe. On the other hand, countries like Hungary and Poland will tend to get more sovereignty, which will put them in confrontation with Brussels, but they can count on Washington's support behind closed doors. Donald Trump is expected to be re-elected in November this year. In 2016, Hillary Clinton took almost 3 million more votes than Trump, but she still lost the Electoral College. That margin could be even wider in 2020, regardless of the potential Democratic Party candidate. That could, however, still result in Donald Trump's re-election, especially if the situation in the Middle East gets worse. It is worth mentioning that in 2011, Donald Trump said that the then US President Barack Obama would attack Iran sometime prior to the election because he thinks that's the only way he can get elected. Some analysts fear that President Trump is the one that might start a war with Iran in order to get re-elected. However, it is not anyone's re-election that runs the US foreign policy. Since the world's natural resources are becoming increasingly scarce, the United States, as the only superpower, will attempt to come into possession of the Iranian natural gas and oil, whether a Democrat or a Republican leads the country. In 2020, the US foreign policy will remain unchanged. America will keep its global dominance and will continue its regime change agenda, which means that energy-rich countries that are not yet under the US protection will face new waves of protests and destabilization. Protests that have shaken Latin America will likely continue, and the US will keep trying to overthrow Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, but will unlikely take any radical measures. The United States is expected to continue the trade war with China, although the two sides might shelve certain tariffs. This year, Washington will start implementing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which means that the US might impose sanctions on certain Chinese and Hong Kong officials. According to 2019, Adam Ni, co-editor of China Nissan, a newsletter on Chinese policy, 2019 was a very bad year for China's international reputation across a whole range of fronts: Hong Kong, Xinjiang, foreign interference, espionage, technology and strategic competition. It is expected that the US will keep provoking China in Hong Kong, which could be Beijing's weak point. Accommodating the protesters' demands even partially would represent a significant loss of face for President Xi Jinping. On the other hand, if the US-backed protesters manage to capture government buildings in Hong Kong or border crossings with mainland China, Beijing will be in a similar position that Russia was in 2014 during the West-sponsored violent protests in Kyiv's Maidan Square in Ukraine. In that case, if China does not intervene, it will demonstrate its weakness, which could have tremendous implications for the country. This year, China will seek to increase its economic pressure in Central Asia, which is a crucial region for Beijing due to its natural resources, especially oil and natural gas. The People's Republic will also be strengthening bilateral trade relations through its Belt and Road Initiative. It will continue to enlarge its economic footprint in Latin America, Southern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa through the new Silk Road. At home, the Chinese government might face a slowing economy, which could raise fears about unemployment. On the other hand, it is expected that on the number of contracts to provide 5G services overseas, Chinese giant Huawei will pull ahead of competition from Ericsson despite the US push to curb the Chinese telecom group due to national security fears. However, some analysts believe that the growing separation between the United States and China in the technology sectors seems to be inevitable. In spite of that, in 2020, China might become the global leader in 5G telecommunications. That's all for today guys, thanks for watching another KJ vid. I hope you enjoyed this video and would love to hear your predictions for 2020. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Finally, please visit our website this year, kjvids.co.uk, and subscribe to one of our plans which will give you unlimited access to our content and the full transcripts of all of our video reports. Thanks for watching again and see you next time.